his name. So in preparation for today, because of our visitors last night, and my inability to answer the question that I exactly when did this all start? I told you that my Bible from being bar mitzvahed had the original date in it. And so I went into my Bible this morning, and sure enough, and this is of course authoritative because a rabbi wouldn't lie. My bar mitzvah was May 10th, 1958, by our counting, but by Hebrew counting, it was the month of ER 20 in the year 5718. So I went and did some math and back calculated then, given I was 13, because I was born on May 8th, I back calculated that this whole thing began in the year 3750. I don't know what month, but we'll use that for, so that's how old the planet is according to the Jewish Genesis. Now, for those of you who are postmodern, you have a different date in mind as to when the planet was originally formed. But there are still people who believe that that's when the earth was created. Okay, so that's the point. Some people still believe. So truth, we're going to talk about truth and what is the truth that Jews preserve today. It's going to be different than your Christian perspective. So remember, I'm Jewish. I'm going to try to emphasize the Jewish perspective on these scriptures. These were Jewish scriptures. Remember, these were written to Jews. They were not written to Christians. Their intent can be interpreted with our understanding of Christ. And sure enough, there's a beauty there. But they're written for Jews, to Jews, about being what? An honest, God-fearing Jew. So this was the user manual for being a Jew. Now, user manuals have a way of changing over time because when they start out, they somewhat start out what you might call in a primitive way. Now, I drew a timeline because Colin's not here, but given his anniversary, I think just to celebrate Colin's rigors here, I drew out a timeline. And on this timeline, I have a lot of detail approximately. So we do have this endpoint at 3750, we know for sure. And over here, we're somewhere in 2021. We know that for sure. This is truth. And there's some things that we have dated back here. The Noah story, somewhere around 2300. Abraham's story, which is the key to Jewish lineage. Even though my tribe goes back to Noah, I'm Ashkenazi, that's one of the sons. My tribe goes all the way back to Noah. I'm 100% Ashkenazi Jew. It was tested, so that's got to be truth. So I can trace myself to here, but I have no idea who the people were in between. We have Abraham. That's the father of the Semitic nations. All of the Semites come through Abraham, and the Muslims too, and they will freely admit it. So that's truth. We know that's true. Go talk to an archaeologist. Go talk to most people. And they will admit there is almost no proof that it is literally true. Oops. So what do we have here? Legend. We have history. That's the challenge in all of our lives, is what we have as a record was the attempt to create a historical level of truth. And so we believe these to be probably factual. We don't think they're fictitious. We don't think they're made up. Over the decades and centuries and thousands of years, these seem to be facts that people accept. They're corroborated by multiple testimonies. They're corroborated by attestation unto death that people believe things. So this should be taken seriously. But is it truth? So one of the things that circulated recently on the internet is this picture. You may have seen this on one of my blogs. This is and I'll show it to the camera over here. This is a picture of truth. And for those of you who can see it here, you have what is a cylinder, but depending on how you shine light on it, it could appear to be a circle or a sphere, or it could appear to be a square. What color is it? What color is it? Who wants to answer the question? What's the color of that cylinder?
Both.
No, go ahead, you know.
I suppose white.
Well, we didn't talk about this last night, and you get the
You
prize.
said it was.
Pardon?
That's what you said it was.
It has to be. Why? Why does it have to be white? Those of you who have any scientific background. White is the presence of all color. If it was orange, when you shine a blue light on it, what would it appear? Black. If it was blue and you shine an orange light on it, what would it appear? Black. That's color theory. Color theory wasn't developed until this period of time. Nobody in the ancient world could explain color theory. The only thing they could explain back then was paint theory. Paint theory is completely different than color theory. Paint theory is when you take red, orange, red, yellow, and blue and mix it together, you get black. When you take red light, blue light, and green light together, what do you get? White. This wasn't developed until this period of time way out here. So anybody writing back here was under a paradigm of paint theory. And so the point with this is whatever is written based upon the perception of the person at that time. Now, to make this even more funny, and this happened in my life, is one of the fellows who helped us build our company was a pilot. Dick, who some of you have heard me talk about, was a pilot. So he cherished pilot stories. And he gave me as a present a rule, the regulations of flying aircraft in 1920. Now, for those of you who remember anything about the Wright brothers, that was about 1903 when they did the first flight. So 1920, flight was in a primitive mode. There wasn't a lot of rules and there weren't a lot of experience. So let me read you some of the rules, the 10 commandments, if you will, of flying an airplane back then. By the way, you're a pilot. Who else in here is a pilot? Okay, so Doug's a pilot. Now, how much training did you go through to?
40 hours.
40 hours just to even be, quote, licensed to get in the air. Let me read you the first rule, and I'm not sure they taught you this one. Don't take the machine into the air unless you believe it'll fly. Can I get an amen? Sorry? Never leave the ground with the motor leaking. Some of these you can tell they had to do it a couple of times before they realized it was a good rule. Never get out of the machine with the motor running until the pilot relieving you is actually at the controls. You can tell the story that occurred that created that one. This one, I don't know how they actually had to put in writing. If you see another machine near you, get out of the way. Pilots should carry hankies in a handy place to wipe off goggles. Learn to gauge your altitude, especially on landing. And the last one, if an emergency occurs while flying, land as soon as possible. Now, I would imagine your training was a bit deeper and broader than that. Yeah, okay. And I'm sure, actually, you were tested, right? I mean, they actually have, I don't know what, pardon? Yeah, I mean, the point is somebody who is qualified observes that you seem to know what you're doing. Okay.
got spurs.
Oh, okay. Well, I have it there. Pilots should not wear spurs while flying. Now, for those of you, why did anybody wear spurs? If they're horseback. Okay, there was standard gear if you were on horseback. Remember, this period of time, cars weren't available. People were on horseback. And so you got off your horse and went in the plane. Well, take the spurs off. Okay, my point with all this is when you see this as a contextual writing, it's laughable, but it's instructive. I think it's enriching, but it's not adequate. So you go, there's got to be more here. There's got to be more here. Well, what we're about to do is to handle a section of scripture that if you don't take all these warnings that I just gave you, you wind up in a bad place, a really, really bad place. So I'm going to read you this section of scripture and then put it in context in what we should learn from where it was. Because remember, what we've got here is we've got a series of very rapid transitions from Saul to David and eventually to Solomon. And this story is basically the beginning of the name of Solomon. You're going to actually be introduced to that character because of the fact that that's the next son of Bathsheba. But the fact is, we're dealing with a rapid transition here. And then there's a period of time when Samuel was written, and it occurred, right, quote, at pretty much the end of the exile. And so there's a warning here. This was written as a warning. This was not written for history. This was not written to hero worship, because you think about all the kinds of things we read about history. Some of it is hero worship. In other words, we just like to hear the story of good things. And sure enough, Saul was not terribly good at anything, but David, in most of the Jews' ideas, was he was a great hero. Really only one or two little events, but he was a hero. Killed Goliath, lucky shot. We covered that weeks ago. But he was a scoundrel. He raped a woman. This isn't a good guy. Why was it written? That's what we're going to cover in a couple of minutes. What on good God's earth was the intent of the author to write about a raping scoundrel just because he had a lucky shot with a stone? There's got to be something there. And there is something here because the transition to the kingdom, which is what we've been talking about, was during this period. But all of this writing, all the way through the point where we have something more to consider, because we have the New Testament, all of this writing is part of, and Colin's covered this, a Deuteronomical. Deuteronomy was the last book of the original 5. This is part of an identity set of scriptures. Whose you are, we covered that before. This is trying to identify that as Jewish people, we are separate, we're separated. And to perpetuate that, what's the single thing, and I blew it, I broke it. What's the single thing Jews are not supposed to do? Marry outside of the lineage. And I did it. Ta-da! I may not be honoring the calling, but the fact is it was the best move in my life. But the fact is that's inviolate as far as Jews are concerned. And they will actually celebrate it with a funeral if that happens in the family. They believe there's a death in the family when the child married. Pardon?
Is it worse than suicide?
I don't know about that, but it's taken very seriously, so much so that my bloodline proves it because I'm 100%. You think about when you go get your ancestry tested or whatever you do, none of you are going to come back 100%. You're not. Mine was 100%. But I blew it. I don't know what kind of eternal damnation I'm under, but I blew it because I broke lineage. And that was incredibly serious. But the thing that we're going to understand as this is written, it was about being assimilated into other cultures. The fear here was losing the identity of Jewishness because you were surrounded by others from other perspectives. It's not that they're wrong. It's not that they're bad, but the preservation of Jewishness. If any of you remember the movie, well, actually it was a play originally, Fiddler on the Roof, the whole play is about his tension of being assimilated by his children into other things. First thing that, quote, they did, if you remember, what was the first offense? The child, what? Found her own mate. We were talking about that last night. In this time, way back when, Jewish girls didn't go decide who they were marrying, period. And apparently in some parts of the world where you've been, the idea of women having the right to choose their mate is still a work in progress, okay? So the point here is that was the first assimilation problem that Tevye had in the movie or the play. The other ones he ran into, of course, was the marrying out of the faith. And that was the one he had a lot of trouble with. And then, of course, there's a funny one about her picking her own mate versus the butcher, where you get this fun dream and a whole bunch of fun stuff. And but you may remember what was Tevye's plea? You know, if I were a rich man. Remember that? Okay. And he talked about Solomon the wise man. So to Jews, David was the hero and Solomon was the wise man. We've already covered Solomon can't have been too wise to have 600 wives. He can't have been. Nobody who has 600 wives has very much intellect. So let's take a look at this story, and I'm going to read it to you. I'm not going to read it to you in the original Hebrew manual here, but I'm going to take it to you, and I'm just going to read it. And this is not pretty. So brace yourself. If you haven't read it before, this is not pretty. When Bathsheba heard that Uriah, her husband, was dead, she mourned for her husband. And when her mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son from the rape. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. Now we meet a new character. The Lord sent Nathan. Nathan, by the way, in Jewish writings, was a prophet. He was a member of the court of David, and he was kind of an advisor. So this would be like if any of you had a company and somebody sidled up to you and said, I got something I got to talk to you about. And he came to him and said, there were two men in one city, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had an exceedingly many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb, which he had bought and nourished, and it grew up together with him and his children. It ate of his food and drink from his own cup and lay in his bosom. It was like a daughter to him. And a traveler came to the rich man who refused to take from his own flock, from his own herd, to prepare for one of the wayfaring man. And he came to him and took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the man who'd come to him. And of course, David then gets angry and says, well, as the Lord lives, this man, what he's done is surely die. And he should restore fourfold for the lamb because he did this thing and because he had no pity. David was quoting the Leviticus rule of restoration and was rightfully pointing out that this was wrong. And Nathan said to David, you're the man. Oops. Thus saith the Lord of Israel, I anointed you king over Israel and delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house and your master's wives in your keeping, gave you the house of Israel and Judah. And if that had been too little, I also would have given you much more. Why have you despised the commandment of the Lord to do evil in his sight? You've killed Uriah the Hittite with the sword. You've taken his wife to be your wife and killed him with the sword of the people of Ammon. Now, therefore, and this is where we've got some history and possibly some propaganda. Now therefore, the sword shall never depart from your house, because you have despised me, and you have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. Thus says the Lord. That's always a warning. Behold, I will raise up adversity against you from your own house, and I will take your wives before your eyes and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of the sun. For you did it secretly, but I will do this before all Israel, before the sun. So David says to Nathan, oh boy, I have sinned against the Lord. Nathan said, the Lord will also put away your sin, for you shall not die. However, because by this deed you have given great occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme, the child also who is born to you shall surely die. How can we worship a God who kills an innocent child? Does anybody want to justify that? Is there any way to see this other than somebody had an intent in writing this? This is a pretty damn severe thing for God to kill an innocent child because of the indiscretion of the father. Can you feel the same problem that Jesus ran into when he had his disciples and they ran into the blind man and they said, who sinned? Can you feel that maybe this story penetrated the hearts and souls of Jews so much so that when things went wrong and bad things happened to people, they assumed somebody had sinned? Why was this written? Well, all you have to do is to go back here and piece together what was happening in Moses when the Deuteronomy was written and what was the warning as they are now about to go into exile. I know we lost. I'll give you the answer as you go. Don't be assimilated. Make sure you love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your mind and all your soul, because if you keep that focus, you're okay. This is a horrible piece of journalism, but it was written for a simple reason. Now, let me take you back into a Jewish mind. I know this isn't where you are. Go ahead.
Here's the scripture that you just read.
Which
In
one?
the Bible, was it in here?
Which one?
The one about the, take the innocent child. What scripture?
That was in 2 Samuel.
Second Samuel.
Yeah, it was actually, if you want the actual place to find it yourself, 2 Samuel 12. There is a problem when you take scripture literally as Christians. When it was written to Jews, by Jews, for Jews, if for nothing other than to warn them about the importance of staying close to God. When we Christians, and I am one, read this, we move it into a post-Jesus mindset, and we don't honor it for what it is. It is not truth the way we see truth. It is truth the way Jews saw truth. It is that picture I showed you. It is not that there is something wrong with what they saw. It was written because these words didn't prick their consciousness. It didn't upset them. You see, the problem when I'm around you and I listen to modern Christian preachers is I go, you don't understand what Jews feel, hear, and think when they read these old things. We don't see them as literal. They're figurative. The literal elements of them are they're abominable. So stop. Look, go ahead.
I'm assuming that Uriah and Bathsheba were Jewish. Is that what you do?
I'm sorry.
I'm assuming that Uriah and Bathsheba were Jewish.
Uriah was not. I believe he was a Hittite. And so that was not a clan. So Bathsheba was married to a non-Jew at the time.
I also wondered, since this was written down probably hundreds of years after it happened.
Yeah, and it was written down about 400 years after the event.
Could it be then that that was the lesson that they took, the Jews took, the perception they had, but whether or not we lay that at God's feet, I would debate that. But that's how they interpret it. When that child died, that was a punishment. Sure.
Yeah, remember, 400 years later, it was considered a fact that this first child had died, and that when they had their makeup sex, they got Solomon. Because he consoled her, and that's when she got pregnant the second time, or third, whatever it was. Yeah, it was written for an intent. It was not written to be a documented proof text. It was written to make sure Jews had a warning. And it was written at almost exactly the time when the exile was about. These writers, these authors, Samuel was supposedly written by this guy, but chances are, because of the amount of time, it was written way after that because of editing. Like, let's remember, okay, because, you know, we have this. Look at the amount of time I'm talking about here. It's 400 years. Think about the problems we have with Jesus, who basically never met Paul, who is writing about Jesus, mostly to try to get Gentiles to get into it, and he did that by a hair's breadth. The Gospels were written, you know, somewhere between 30 and 100 years, 30 and 70 years after the event. This is 450 years later. It finally gets into print. There has to be an intent. And that's what I'm trying to focus on. Intent. Why did somebody write that? Because, not for the same reasons you are here. The Jews were being bombarded by other cultures because they'd been taken into captivity to give up being Jewish. Assimilation. I personally think if you want to prove God exists, the fact that we still exist is a miracle. There is no justification for us to exist. There have been societies and thousands of years trying to eliminate the Jewish people. We have been this, you want to talk about racism, we have been the purged group throughout history. And the fact that I could sit here in front of you and claim 100% genetic ancestry is proof that this is not the work of man. So you could say, was that God's chosen people? Like we're special? No, we are to honor God by recognizing the reason we're here. It's not who we are, it's whose we are. And so the fact is that, and you know, we had this conversation, Susan and I and Stephen, you know, the writing style of Jews. There's only one exception here in the New Testament as to who wrote the New Testament. It's all Jewish literature. Only have Luke as the exception. It's all Jewish storytelling. So we should be careful too when we look at some of the craziness, especially as we got out from the early writings and we get some of the later writings where people were coping with the human tendencies that occur throughout life, and they started writing things, and from which we get women should be silent in church. You remember that one? Some people land on individual things to prove their reason for what they really wanted to do in the first place, which was to put down women. Some of the greatest Old Testament stories are from the book of Ruth and from those other Jewish women. Jewish women were the reason the faith persists in the home. I don't know if you understand that. You have to grow up in a Jewish home to understand that. The father brings in the livelihood. The faith tradition of the family is the responsibility of the mother. Think about that. The faith tradition of the family rests on the woman in the home. Talk about a responsibility. Most of the education back then occurred the same way. The father tried to provide food. The mother raised the children, probably educated them, and most importantly, kept the faith alive. Isn't that interesting? So here's the issue, and I'm going to summarize it by, I just want you to think about some words. So what is history? Is it a true story? It has an intent. And what we need to know is what's the intent of this? The intent was not literal. The intent was to understand who was the reason these people existed. And what was it, Bob, your favorite one? How odd of God to choose the Jews was the, now, do you remember who the author of that phrase was? Bennett Cerf. So what's the difference between history and a tale? If I say that that's the tale, these are all tales. Pardon?
We learn from history.
Yeah, but what's a tale?
Made up.
We put the word imaginary because that's the way we would think about it. Go check the dictionary. There's a different word there. Imaginative. Does that make it imaginary? What is imaginative good for? It captures your attention. And so it's a storytelling style that captures your attention. Legend. What's a legend? Do we have a legend here? Is this legend? Pardon?
I think legends are passed down
Over
orally.
They're mostly oral. They're unprovable. And so we don't call them history. They're called legends. What's a myth?
Universal truth.
Well, no, what if I say this is mythological?
Again, I think they have a.
We in modern language will automatically say, well, then that's no different than Santa Claus and a bunch of other things. That's just not true. No, mythological, go ahead and check it in the dictionary, means a supernatural element is in the story. Meaning you can't explain it in regular human terms. Well, isn't this mythological? Just for completeness, what's a fable?
Story with a meaning.
Pardon?
Story with a meaning.
Well, that's true, but so is myth.
Has animals.
Animals and insects are in the story. And they seem to have anthropomorphic characteristics, meaning we see and hear the story as if ants and lions and tigers are talking to each other. And last time I was with you, I told you the story of our ants and the bird feeder. By the way, this morning, Susan, that bird feeder is working, so they're back. I didn't see any ants. All right, I want to end on something here, just as a lighthearted thing that, you go, this stuff is, this is really hard for me to listen to, Joel. But last night, I told you of a story that I'd written in one of my essays. And I'm just going to end with it because it's a true story about a mythological figure. And we'll end there. You probably remember the story of, yes, Virginia, there is a Santa Claus. I'm going to read you that. And I want you to think about all of what I've been saying and whether it's actually true or not true. Now, how many of you still believe in Santa Claus as a physical guy trying to get down a chimney? Okay. Okay.
Ask me close to Christmas.
Here's the way it actually was written. In 1897, Dr. Philip Hanlon was asked by his then 8-year-old daughter, Virginia, whether Santa Claus really existed. Virginia had begun to doubt whether there was a Santa Claus because her friends had told her he didn't exist. Dr. Hanlon suggested she write to the New York Sun, a prominent New York City newspaper at the time, assuring her that if you see it in the sun, it's true. While he may have been passing the buck, he unwittingly gave one of the paper's editors, Francis Church, an opportunity to rise above the simple question and address the philosophical issues behind it. Francis Church was a war correspondent during the American Civil War, a time which saw great suffering and corresponding lack of hope and faith in much of society. Although the paper ran the editorial in the 7th place on the editorial page, below even an editorial about the newly invented bicycle, it was very moving, and more than a century later, it remains the most reprinted editorial to ever run in the English language worldwide. Now, I'm going to read it to you because what I'm going to read to you is obviously mythological. But then the question is it true? Virginia asked, "Dear editor, I'm 8 years old. Some of my little friends say there's no Santa Claus. Papa says if you see it in the sun, it is so. Please tell me the truth. Is there a Santa Claus?" The editor responds, "Virginia, your little friends are wrong. They have been affected by skepticism of a skeptical age. They do not believe except what they see. They think that nothing can be which is not comprehensible by their little minds. All minds, Virginia, whether they be men's or children's, are little. In this great universe of ours, man is a mere insect, an ant in his intellect as compared to the boundless world about him, as measured by the intelligence capable of grasping the whole truth and knowledge." I gotta put this in context. Here we are, post-Holy Wars, post-Renaissance. Here we are in this period of time called postmodern with a skeptical world around us. Tell me you don't feel that. Who won't honor any of this stuff. Most recently, we have progressives who are behind the reason for a lot of this movement towards a complete extreme postmodernism. Now, let me read this, and you're going to feel, remember, this was written right in his period of time in the early 1900s. And these are words I'm going to try to say without tearing up. "Yes, Virginia, there is a Santa Claus. He exists as certainly as love and generosity and devotion exist. And you know that they abound and give to your life its highest beauty and joy. Alas, how dreary would the world be if there were no Virginias? There would be no childlike faith then, no poetry, no romance to make this tolerable world, to make tolerable this existence. We should have no enjoyment except in sense and sight. The eternal light which childhood fills the world would be extinguished. Only faith, fancy, poetry, love, romance can push aside the curtain and view and picture the supernatural beauty and glory beyond." Whew. Faith, fancy, poetry, love, romance can push aside the curtain and view and picture the supernatural beauty and glory beyond. Is it all real? Virginia, in all this world, there's nothing else real and abiding. Whew. No Santa Claus? Thank God he lives and he lives forever. 1,000 years from now, Virginia, nay, 10 times 10,000 years from now, he will continue to make glad the heart of childhood. So, is this just clever writing? Or does it express something bigger? So when we read this stuff, do we get hung on the words? Do we literally carry all the words into our argument? Or do we see the intent behind it to try to instill a love for God and to keep them from falling into the communities of belief that they were going to be captured by? Our latest group, by the way, this is an out war right now. You and I are being attacked by this group. We need to be careful. These scriptures speak to us today as well as they did then. We are under attack. This is the same thing that was written way back when to keep the Jews from assimilating. This group is not taking any prisoners. This group is out for blood, and you can feel it.
Are these the science-based people who say there is no God because they consider it science?
If you take from what I did earlier and look at the Hidden Tribes documents, go back to my old emails. If you don't have them, if you want it, I'll send it again. Hidden Tribes. Go ahead and just look at Hidden Tribes and what the progressives believe. There is no God. They absolutely, adamantly will state that, period. If that doesn't attack you and me and make you wonder, I don't know what will. I really don't know how I could get your attention. That to me is a central fear we all should be fearful of. Progressives are not our friends. That doesn't mean we don't love them, but we've been warned. We've been warned many times before about this. All right, I need to stop. And I'm sorry to end on such a dour note. But I keep some things like this around just because I'm trying to keep myself from losing my own mind. I had one funny little story I think I was going to tell you besides the one around flying. Let's see if I can find it very quickly. And